Ian, let's have a little word about lost musicals first of all, so that we can put it in perspective for the programme. A little summary of that would be nice, how that all came about, what it's all about. And then you can work in from that into how it was you discovered Jerome Moross, and in particular, The Golden Apple.
In the late 80s, I was very much aware that musicals were still very, very popular. And yet, all one really was given the opportunity of seeing would be the usual revivals of, say, My Fair Lady or A West Side Story. Not that there's anything wrong with My Fair Lady or West Side Story, or more of a sort of a pop type musical. And I was also aware that there were a huge group of American writers, composers, lyricists, and librettists from the past. And these writers would be of the A-list with a huge canon of work behind them, whose specific works either commercially failed or for whatever reason have been forgotten and neglected. And so I went on the hunt for the material, the lesser known material by the most important writers of the United States of the 20th century. And I went to the Victoria and Albert Museum, who at that point had a theatre museum in Covent Garden. And I put together a series of several shows, thereby a sort of a season. And it began there and then moved to the Barbican, then the Royal Opera House, and currently Sadler's Wells. And the BBC have broadcast some of these shows. I'm quite authentic in how I present the material. I don't change, edit, improve the writing. What people get to witness is exactly, warts and all, what these very important writers wrote.
Well, isn't that fascinating? I remember Margaret Benton. You probably remember her. She ran
I do.
and I had an association with the Theatre Museum myself.
I do.
But I'm very keen and happy to hear about the authenticity that you're talking about there. This is vital for us, and in particular, it I think relates now to the whole issue of Jerome Moross and. Really, I mean, it is a lost musical, The Golden Apple. I think one of the most disappointing things about that was that the CD that was made of the music, I mean, you know, it's about a quarter of the whole piece.
My feeling about that recording, that 1954 RCA recording, is it's better to have it than not to have it. And not only do we have it, and do we at least sample the material, we are hearing the material as the writers wanted it performed, and the people who perform the material clearly were chosen by those writers to some degree. So the authenticity about the style of the presentation is so useful. But because The Golden Apple in itself is quite a sophisticated affair for a commercial Broadway musical of 1954, that truncated recording, as you say, which eliminates so much of the material, can confuse you as to what on earth is this whole thing about.
Now, that's good what you've just said about many things there that I want to pick up on, because the casting and the style, actually, you know, as we all know, there have been one or two songs from that, famously, of course, Lazy Afternoon, that have become terribly popular, totally taken out of their context, and in my view, usually not performed with the subtlety and complexity. I did an interview with Kay Ballard, actually.
Oh, good.
And I really have never heard anybody who's given it what I think is the undertone all the way through the piece, which is a pathos. It's one of these wonderful works that is, to me, bittersweet, and on the face of it can be taken as a rip-roaring comedy if you want, but is, in my view, is not. So I'd love to hear you about that, because it seems to me that those performers at that time, we get these feelings, and Jerry Stiller, another one, those people, they seem to have given it a quality that actually I'm not sure people who sang extracts from it much later on really understood.
Well, of course, you know, anybody doing anything that is current, however avant-garde it may be, has more possibility of locking into what it is supposed to be, as opposed to looking at anything from the past and trying to recreate whether it be, you look at Fred Astaire, what Fred Astaire was doing on the screen was at that moment de rigueur, was hot, was new, was coming from that person. But if you examine his work 50 years on, which is always still done, trying to recreate it is nothing more than a recreation.
That is very true. But if we take that point you've made, which is very important, how do we see the Golden Apple today? I mean, it is a lost musical, isn't it? And couldn't it? Maybe I'm just romanticising and fantasising, but could it be performed today in a way that people would respond to and understand and really feel what it was all about?
John, one of the problems with the Golden Apple and so much of the material written, certainly in the United States commercially, say in a 20-year period, say from 30 to 50 or something like that, is by today's standards, the material seems quite highfalutin and rather too sophisticated. What was written for the taxi driver to take his wife as an entertainment for a few dollars, as a commercial entertainment, when you examine that material today, 2013, 60, 70 years on, it really seems a little bit too intellectual. Today, people wouldn't even understand the points of reference. For example, the Golden Apple, to enjoy an element of that material, you have to be a bit familiar with Greek mythology. Well, today people aren't taught any Greek mythology. Wordplay. John Latouche, who did that lyric writing for that show, he was clearly very smart, unbelievably well read, and that comes through. So there are points of wordplay and references in his writing. Well, if you've got a more contemporary education, there will be blanks. So one of the issues about some of this commercially money-making written material is, by today's standards, it's actually too sophisticated for a commercial audience.
Do you think, though, in that respect, that because of the change of time and, in a sense, the prophetic nature in many ways of this musical, in terms of certain developments that did take place later on, do you feel that it could be a candidate for an opera house performance? I mean,
well, it's so interesting you say this, because when I was working on the show in 1991, which is quite a while ago, I suddenly thought, well, this is quite rich pickings, and this could never be performed successfully, commercially, in the West End or on Broadway, and it does require a lot of highly trained musical people to perform it, certainly to sing the material. And I thought, well, the logical place would be somewhere like English National Opera. So I went to English National Opera, this is in 1991, and I spoke to the right person at English National Opera, and I explained that this show, The Golden Apple, is really the precursor to Leonard Bernstein and John Latouche's Candide. I don't think Candide would have happened, actually, in my opinion, without The Golden Apple, and that would have been because John Latouche, who worked with Jerome Moross on Golden Apple, then a few years later worked with Leonard Bernstein, and then died actually during the writing of Candide with Bernstein. So I think that there's a direct connection between the two pieces. But when I went to E&O, I explained that this was the forerunner of Candide. They had not heard of Jerome Moross, they hadn't heard of John Latouche actually. But that being the case, I think that had they have gone ahead, and they certainly considered the Golden Apple, I think the Golden Apple actually would have lost its common touch. And there is a common touch. There's a common touch to Fred Astaire. There's a common touch even to great art, because actually art isn't all about being special. Art is about a communication. And to communicate, you have to have the street parley, whatever you do.
You came up with something terribly important about the common touch in art, which is a very important point. And this is the dilemma of being able to get something like the Golden Apple in, you were talking about English National Opera. Now, I was hoping we might find a sort of way of arguing that it could successfully be done today in an opera house, but I'm beginning to think maybe it couldn't. But over to you again.
Today, 2013, when you're looking at the Golden Apple, there are certain things which you can't really ignore. The first thing to begin with is the music. There's an incredible musical score there, beautifully orchestrated by Hershey Kay and Jerome Moross. Well, you need an orchestra to play it. And as we know more and more so, people are going to shows in the West End and Broadway. Broadway, you can spend $300 a ticket. And you may get 7 musicians in the pit with a synthesizer. The Golden Apple actually is quite a play. You actually need a full Broadway orchestra there. So that's the first issue, i.e. costs. The second issue is, where will you get an orchestra? Well, probably with an opera company. Great. Well, with an opera company, you get singers. But are you getting theatre people? No, you're getting singers. But the Golden Apple was a Broadway musical, so it was full of theatre people who sang exceptionally well. So in one thing, as I say in life, you solve one problem and you create another problem. Yes, you could, and probably the logical place would be an Opera North or a Metropolitan Opera House or English National Opera. But I would be nervous that you would lose its theatricality, and actually it would be a bit of a one-dimensional vehicle for opera singers to sing opera. And as we know, opera singers sing. The Golden Apple, ironically, even with this exceptional score, like all good American stuff of the period, was word-driven. Words, words, words. You have to hear the words, you have to enjoy the wordplay, and then the huge bonus is the score. But opera companies don't particularly enjoy selling words, they enjoy selling voices.
How did you tackle it in 1991?
Well, I tackled it the way I tackle most of the 75 odd shows that I've presented in Lost Musicals, even now at Sadler's Wells. I just have piano, and I have a appropriate cast of 15, 20. We may have had actually 20 people for Golden Apple. And so no amplification. So in actual fact, the material, the focus on the material was making sure the audience certainly got the nuts and bolts of the music, all the music, and they certainly got the word-driven material. It was as simple as that. But I think for a more commercial presentation, it's a tricksy one. It's a tricksy one because I think today it can only sit in an opera company because of the orchestra and all the rest of it, all the rest of the stuff they'd have and good singers. But I think it could lose a huge dimension too. I suppose the ideal world would be something like the National Theatre, because they have the funds of saying, come on, let's go out on a limb. Because they did it with Candide, actually, a few years ago. Let's do the Golden Apple. We have the funds for an orchestra. We'll search our company and we'll search London for actors who actually can sing as well as they need to sing. I'm sure that's the way, because it is a theatre piece. It is a theatre piece.
Well, you've given me one of the most honest and searching interviews for a long time. I'm very, very grateful.
Thanks, John.